Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Facebook live broadcast. I'm Steve Altition, Director of Client Partnerships here at Pacific Cascade Family Law. And today we have behavior coach and best-selling author Gail Rudolph with here to discuss how you can harness your power to reclaim control in divorce and make co-parenting a win-win situation. So how you doing, Gail?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me today.
Oh, thank you for coming. And before we start in, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I think probably your audience would love to know that I actually am going through a divorce myself. This book was actually started after my divorce began, and it had a lot to do with me understanding the subject that we're going to talk about today, which is your own personal power.
Well, since we are going to talk about power and harnessing power, I'm going to start with a basic question. What is power?
Power is simply defined as the capacity or the ability to direct or influence the behavior of others or a course of events. It's kind of an energy that ebbs and flows as we interact with others, and it's central to every one of our interactions that we have. You see, how we communicate verbally and non-verbally is more energetic, and our ability to affect and express our power comes in our ability to harness our power. I think it's sad because too many people today feel powerless when they actually aren't. It's actually rooted in our self-limiting beliefs. And I believe that there's always personal power to be assessed. You see,
So
oh,
you use nonverbal. Um,
verbal.
so power can be not just the words you speak, it can be the way you move your eyes.
It actually can. It can be the way you stand. It can be taking up space when you're sitting down. It can be choosing or not choosing. Sometimes we sit small. We take up very little space. It's our tone of voice. It's our eye contact. It's everything that we do that's
Oh
nonverbal.
my gosh. Oh my gosh.
And it's something that we don't have to seek permission about having power. Our own personal power is something that we always have. It's already there. And I think that one of the key things that we need to understand, it's about harnessing our personal power. Nobody takes our power away. We actually, Steve, give it away sometimes because we're being quiet or we're trying to keep the peace. And we don't want to do that. Your personal power is yours and it's there for you to assess. And it's about choosing the right way to do it.
Wow. So how, we talked about harnessing power, how, and I guess also why do we want to harness our power?
You see, there's kind of a space between a stimulus and response. And Viktor Frankl actually talks about that, where he talks about the space between a stimulus and a response. And harnessing our power and tapping into our power actually allows us to use that space. So when we think about that, we can use our mistakes, our failures, and our setbacks as guideposts then for learning and growing. See, when we harness our power, when we take that space and harness it in the right way, it leads to positive interactions with others. It leads to getting things done and creating an environment where cooperation and diversity really flourishes. See, at the most basic level, power is channeled by our mindset, our body movements, and our verbal interactions, and the way we use our tone of voice. We need to plug into the appropriate power response really at any given situation. See, if when we understand how to harness our innate personal power, we give off cues and signals that are indicators to our powers and influence. If you've ever been in a room and somebody walks in and you don't know what their title is, you don't know what their position is, but you can just feel that they have power, they seem very sure of themselves, that's personal power.
Is this something we have a choice over, or does power give us more choices? I mean, I know you, when I was reading your book, you kind of had the two together, the power and choice.
Yeah, power and choice are actually, they go hand in hand. So we have a conscious choice to make. We can look at other people many times, especially our ex-spouses, as a natural enemy where we fear power and our fear comes into play, or we can choose to flip the script and realize that people and situations and difficulties are there to help us grow and to strengthen our ability and character. You know, when we decide to harness our power with the correct attitude, it gives us the capacity to overcome challenging circumstances. You know, things like co-parenting with an uncooperative or hostile ex-spouse.
Yeah, I imagine that. So power, you want to use it to dominate?
No, absolutely not. Power is not about domination. Remember, when we talked about power, it's our ability to actually influence a situation. Power, dominance, coercion, hostility, and creating things as a contest, it is not power. That's actually dominance, and nobody wins in that situation. Nobody. And when we actually harness our personal power in the right way, when we make the choice to use our power and influence, we can actually maintain and relationships, and we can grow, and we actually become more accepting of other people and their ideas. But if we're trying to dominate, that's not real power.
Then it's not a I win, you lose thing.
Absolutely not. We want to create a personal empowerment. So the things I talk about a lot is that when we talk about power, power is actually a choice that we make, and it empowers both people. And when we think about people like Martin Luther King, he was the ultimate about powering up and powering down, but he empowered those people around him. But he at the same time maintained his own personal power.
It seems like in a divorce situation, and you obviously are close to that, right? That, you know, it's tough not to use it as a, you know, way to win or force someone else to do. It's got to be not easy sometimes when you're with a spouse that is not being exactly cooperative.
Well, I think that if our spouses were cooperative, we'd still be married. We wouldn't be going through a divorce.
That's true.
So I think that there's some expectation we're dealing with an uncooperative person. But what we don't realize is that we hold our own personal power. And when we lose our temper, when we try to control, when we waste our energy in those ways, what happens is that we actually end up giving our power away. That's why
Wow.
it's so much of a choice.
That leads to this other thing you wrote in your book, and it was really interesting. I have a power switch on one of my, you know, in the kitchen. And, you know, you hit it and it goes on and off, and then you move it and it goes up and down. And half the time I you know, don't know how to use it right. It sounds weird, but you had talked in your book about powering up and powering down. I'm sure it's not about the switch in the kitchen.
Well, in a way it is. It's about tapping into the right power source or using the right power tool that you need. You know, just like you plug in something to an outlet, you know, you have to make sure that it's the right kind of outlet. There's different types of outlets for different things. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about power. You see, it's a choice. You can either power up or you can power down. It's about controlling yourself and how you present yourself. You see, when you power up, it's kind of a choice that you make to step into fuller presence. When I talked about spreading your arms out, you know, taking up more space, different tones of voice, lowering, using strategic pauses, that's powering up. When you talk about powering down, it's a choice to make a change or a stance, kind of to level the playing field. What we know about human behavior is that we have a tendency to butt up against each other. When we get pushed, we push back. And when you start that type of power struggle or that type of power dynamic that happens, nothing gets done. Nothing gets accomplished. So when you are conscious about, I'm going to stand up here and I'm going to harness and power up in this situation in an appropriate way, because I always say the moment you lose your temper, you give your power away. Or you choose that I'm going to step back now and I'm going to power down a little bit, let the other person maybe interrupt me, maybe not make so much eye contact, to create a playing field where that power struggle doesn't happen. It's about tapping into the right power tool at the time.
And that sounds like it's not control as in I'm going to control you, but it's a way to help control the situation from maybe going skyrocketing out of control.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We waste a lot of time and energy trying to control other people. And the truth of the matter is the only people that we can really control is ourselves. But if we can control ourselves, we can control the interaction. And even though we might not get or have complete control over the outcome we have, we can walk away feeling good about ourselves. And that's where true power and personal empowerment comes in.
And that's kind of a goal, in terms of, again, when you get to the co-parenting kind of situation where the other spouse is not cooperating and no matter what you try doesn't work, and a lot of times you end up just feeling bad about yourself. It isn't just that, maybe life is a little more difficult, but it really is detrimental to yourself.
It absolutely is. The book is about moving out of a habitual state of consciousness and moving more into kind of a creative and a purposeful way of interacting. It's about, us harnessing our own interpersonal power and taking that and use it to create something better for ourselves, something better for the world we live in, and definitely something better for our children.
And powering up and powering down isn't something that just sort of reflects or responds to. It sounds like it's something you again, like the switch, you control it. You intentionally move it up or down.
I've struggled with power my whole life. I was the youngest child of 4 children. My brother was 18 years my senior. I spent from 2 years old, I wanted to be heard and felt like I had some power or to be understood. And what happened to me as I went throughout my career, what I learned is that power is actually our response. It's something that can be learned, it can be taught. And I actually wrote the book as a guidebook to actually be able to do that, to learn how to move into a reaction instead of a response. And it really can make a difference. It'll make a difference in you feeling empowered.
I like that. I like that term, a reaction instead of a response. The response just is one of those, like, I always call it like a knee jerk kind of thing.
And I was just going to say, and what's great about it is because it can be learned and taught, when you start stepping into your own personal power, your children then learn how to do that and hold their power in the right way. And they're watching. They're watching to see how you interact with that ex-spouse.
You wrote also about power, sort of how it works with or against, fear, intuition, and and in divorces and separations, kind of, learning to co-parent. That all kind of comes in, doesn't it?
It does. When we're going through a divorce, our life is chaotic, right? And there's a lot for us to process. But when we work in our fast processing brain, what happens with our brain is that we automatically move to reactions. So many times we're working out of automatic mode. We're kind of sleepwalking, and it becomes blurred as to how we should react or respond. But when we stop and we think about power, then we can move into what we call our slow brain, and we actually make a choice. And that's when we can make a difference. That's when it comes into play. And what happens is that we work on our fast brain, we move into fear. And our fast brain often perceives a threat, especially when we're talking about an ex, right? And what happens with fear is that we want to approach it with caution. And instead of trusting our intuition, we fall into this fear mode. And fear sometimes creates this kind of environment where we react, we get panicked. But intuition is a little different. Intuition is our subconscious ability to evaluate our prior knowledge and to experience and to gain on our experience with aspects of our past and our present. It allows us to kind of get a vibe of the situation, to stop and to think about it, and it guides us. You see, fear wants us to move and to react, and it's fast. It's kind of always there. It's always present. Intuition, on the other hand, it actually comes in softly. It's not something that has to be acted on immediately. It shows up occasionally, right? For important life decisions where conclusions and answers aren't always readily available. And when we talk about power, what we're talking about is moving out of fear that can be based out of guilt or self-doubt, and moving into more of our intuition, where we move into our inner wisdom of how to handle things. You know, I really hope that the listeners and everybody here learn to trust their intuition and recognize that fear, and realize that it's attempting a lot of times to disguise itself, right? It creates a mask for us. And we need to really tap into our inner wisdom, because we have it. And that's where our trust comes from, of our power. And when we can trust our intuition, we can fully step and harness our ability to step into our power. And it creates a calm knowing. It's not frantic. And in our intuition really is our key to know when to power up and power down, and what power tools to use at what time.
It makes such sense. It's kind of again, I think of that as the chicken, the light meat and the dark meat. There's fast twitch muscles that were really fear, and they were fight or flee. And then the slow muscles, which nourish you. They act all the time to slowly keep continuing to nourish you. It kind of works like that, but it can be hard. I would imagine, especially again when co-parents aren't working together, or you're in the middle of a divorce, to do that, to just teach yourself to do that. That's got to take a lot of practice.
It actually takes a slowing down. So if you remember when you first learned to drive a car, I mean, you thought about everything you were doing. You thought about how much you turned the wheel. You thought about when to, when you went into a curve, when to let off the gas, when to put on the gas. There were so many things that were in your conscious mind. Now we drive in a subconscious way. We can be thinking about something else and whiz right past our intersection, or drive and get home and not remember anything that all along the way.
Yeah.
What that is that's an example of when we were first learning to drive, it was our slow brain that was actually working. Then it moved into our fast brain and we don't think about it. What we're talking about with power, it's not about relearning. It's about slowing down and moving back into that slow brain. That's how we actually respond instead of reacting. When we're working on our fast brain, we do an automatic response. When we respond, we're working out of our slow brain, and we're choosing how we're going to behave and respond.
Is there a neutral? Is there like a power neutral? And what tells you to get out of neutral maybe and go up or down?
You know what? We all have a natural inclination to either power up or power down, but we are not very often power neutral. That's where we need to maximize our influence. We need to work to having both sides of the power coin, because that's what it is. It's the two sides of the same coin at our disposal. So we need to know when power plays are available, and what power tools we should use, and which ones are most effective to create a better outcome and maximize our influence. The other is we need to access power and employ it effectively. It is vital to shift from that habitual reaction to a thoughtful response in a situation. And it gives us a different handle on the players and the things that are involved. Some of us tend to power down a lot out of habit. We give off clues that we're unsure of ourselves, our expertise, and the viewpoints that we have to share. And when we adopt those nonverbal cues, we need to actually decide to change those, to present ourselves, and to help to use those powering down moves to put people at ease instead of letting go of our own personal power. However, a lot of times when we talk about powering up, we think of that being bullying, and that is never, ever the case. That is not power. It is possible actually to power up and to firmly make it known that we possess control and that we can still remain courteous and kind while remaining full in our power.
So powering up doesn't necessarily mean being the one that talks all the time.
Absolutely.
Goodness for me.
Sometimes that gives your power away.
But you say listening is important as well.
Active listening is very, very important when we talk about power, because it's a technique that requires us to fully concentrate and comprehend and respond to what's being said, both verbally and non-verbally. See, when we think about having a power tool to be able to pull and use, we need to engage that active listening and focus on words that are being said while also being acutely in tune to the tone of voice and the body language that's being exhibited to us. You see, when we become aware of our emotions as well as the emotions of other people, it gives us valuable insights. This is where we should not underestimate our intuition, because it can be instrumental during this activity and be active during this time as we're listening. It provides a well-rounded idea of the true meaning of communication and hearing what that other person says and what's being said to us. Then we can truly pick the right response that we need to make.
You talk about bullying, and power doesn't necessarily mean bullying or pushing boundaries. And so tell us a little bit about that. I mean, there's boundaries we have, and there's power, and there's got to be a limit to either the power or the boundaries. It's the immovable object versus the irretrievable force.
I refer to boundaries as the secret sauce to power. We don't always think about them that way, but they're really the secret sauce to us maintaining our power. You see, boundaries are just really limits that we set around our time, our energy, and our money. And they're parameters that create a reasonable, safe, and permissible way for other people to behave towards us. And a lot of times, as a recovering what I call people pleaser, I let my boundaries actually be plowed over many times and didn't create those parameters that were reasonable, safe, and permissible ways for others to behave towards me. They also define how we will respond should our limits be breached. They're so essential when it comes to power. But there's a distinct difference between power and boundaries. When we hold firm to our personal limits, we are defining and establishing our true empowerment. Through maintaining and holding our boundaries, we show where we will and will not be moved.
Wow. This is a dance. The power, the up, the down, the boundaries. I mean, this is a almost feels like it's an art as well as a skill. But someone's gonna, push through or try to push through. What happens when you get those people who just keep pushing?
We do. We get a lot of people, and I think that you're right. It is a dance, and we've learned a lot of times how to actually we think we know how to respond to, especially a spouse. But when we step back and we look at where our boundaries are, there's safeguards to where our boundary lines are. But people are constantly trying to push through our boundaries, whether it's a spouse, whether it's people at work. It's really important that we, first of all, clearly define what our boundaries are for us, where we will not be moved, to clearly communicate. But if we have somebody who's trying to, what I call, bust through our boundaries, we need to ask ourselves a lot of times, am I saying yes to something I want to say no to? And if that's coming up, then we need to make sure that we understand why we were doing it. There are different ways that we relinquish our boundaries. The first one is internal pressure. We feel like we have to, that we, for some reason, or maybe loss or grief or fear of the unknown, that we need to give into our boundaries. Those are internal pressures that we need to look at. There's external pressures. Those are those people telling us that we need to change our boundary or persuade us to do or act in a different way. And when we relinquish our boundaries, sometimes it springs out of something inside of us, out of obligation or fear or guilt. And both internal and external influencers and boundaries, to cross our boundaries, they can be pretty strong at times. They're forces that can either sabotage and allow other people to take over, and actually what happens is we end up giving our power away.
Yeah. So, for instance, as an example, it's my weekend to not have the kids, and I've made plans. We're going to go somewhere. We're going to take 2 days to just get ourselves relaxed. And the ex calls up 11:30 at night and says, "Oh yeah, you can't do that. We got to change. I got to go to this thing. So yeah, you're going to have." What do you do?
That never happens, Steve. Never. That's kind of a constant a lot of times when it comes with dealing with your ex. And what we need to do is we need to ask ourselves, how does this make us feel? Examine the symptoms. Are you saying yes, possibly, to something that you want to say no to? And then identify kind of the root cause. Is there something in your past or your childhood that taught you to relinquish your boundaries, where other people, possibly family or even friends, asking you to help them out of binds they've gotten themselves into, and why you feel that you need to say yes? Is it because you've had things in your past that's, you're scared that they're going to threaten to withdraw their affection if you don't say yes? And then there's always a need. Identify your own personal need, why you feel to say yes. Is it fear of abandonment? Is it guilt? Examine what's causing you to allow this person to step all over your boundaries and for you to give your power away. You have to identify that need. And then the next thing is to be prepared for it. Respond instead of react. Okay, take a deep breath, collect yourself. Then you could respond with something like, it sounds like you had a tough week, and you've had something unexpected come up, and that's a problem. I understand you're in a tight spot, but I won't be able to help you out with such short notice. I'd be happy to help you at a different time if you'd give me at least 2 weekdays notice in advance. We know that some situations are going to happen. So preparing for them ahead of time, having something to say and respond that holds your power is extremely important.
That makes such sense. One of the powers that I know you talked about in your book was the power of forgiveness. Can you talk about that?
This is so hard to do when you're going through a divorce, because a divorce is one of life's top 5 most stressful experiences. You're ending a relationship and dividing up a life that once was together, and it's painful. It is like a death. And one of the things is that there's emotions involved. You're hurt, you're angry, and a lot of times that anger and that hurt, we can get paralyzed by it. But holding on to that hurt actually consumes us. It also gives our power away. Now, I know that sounds funny because you could think about, okay, I'm giving my power away because I'm mad and I'm angry at the other person, but it is. You know, there's a person that once said that holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. You know, we need to stop pretending that our past doesn't affect our present, because it does. But when we decide to forgive, we can regain our sense of self and our personal power. It's incredibly difficult to forgive somebody who's inflicted harm or pain upon us. But we need to remember that forgiveness is about freedom. It's about our freedom.
Is it, you hear the comment sometimes, well, I can forgive, but not forget. Is it easy to kind of confuse those two?
Absolutely. Absolutely. See, we have no control over the other person has hurt us, either intentionally or not. They may never apologize or show any remorse for the things that they've done to us. But when we hold a grudge and we harbor ill towards them, then we are choosing to deepen and prolong our pain rather than address it and move forward. See, it's so easy to confuse forgiving with forgetting. And many of us have been taught that when we forgive, that we're supposed to forget. This simple error, I think, is what causes so many of us to hold on to our anger and pain much longer than necessary. You see, forgiveness is not about justifying the other person's actions, right? Or letting them off the hook, or saying that you'll reconcile, or even forgetting the hurtful actions. See, forgiveness is a gift that we give ourselves. It's about letting go of somebody else's hold over us and moving forward into bigger and better things. You know, when we think that all things come into our life, good and bad, they will either make us stronger or will cripple us. We have a choice to make. And the good news is we get to view how we want to live our lives.
Yep.
The good news is we get to choose that.
Yep. We're getting near our end, but I just want to kind of, the things you said were just really, really informative and insightful. And thinking about that, the you're in a divorce or you're in a co-parenting situation with a difficult ex-spouse, all of the things you talk about, and as you kind of were saying, it isn't just controlling and empowering you, but the people around you, to make everybody at least more civil, if not more cooperative. But it sounds like this is an influence that influences not just yourself.
Well, again, when we can control ourselves, when we respond with the appropriate response, we can change the interaction. And I always say that when you change the interaction, that's when you can start changing the world. You can start changing your environment. That's where it begins, is in that interaction. And the only person you really can control is yourself. And when you can walk away feeling good about how you handled yourself in an interaction, you remain powerful, then you're empowered.
Well, thank you, Gail. This was wonderful. It really was insightful. Really want to thank you for being here today to give us just insightful look into understanding the power dynamics involved in divorce and co-parenting, and kind of using that understanding to reclaim control and improve your post-divorce relationships. I just think it's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Steve, for having me join you. This is something, again, that's very close to my heart because I'm going through it. And, I really hope that everybody understands you can start using your own interpersonal power today by changing how you respond.
Thank you. And thank everyone who is watching for joining us today. If anyone has any further questions on today's topic, you can post it here. We can help get you connected with Gail. And with that, everyone, stay safe, stay happy, and we'll see you at our next Pacific Cascade Family Law Facebook Live. So long.